So begin with our motivation, and again rejoicing at our precious human life, instead of taking it for granted, because it could end any moment. Really appreciating each moment of this life, wanting to make it useful, and shedding all the ways that we get distracted from doing that, shedding all the ways that we use to defend our ego, to prove that we're not to blame, to prove that we're good people, to show that everybody should like us and appreciate us. Now let's leave all of that behind and just focus the mind on how can I grow in the Dharma? Not how can I defend my ego, but how can I grow in the Dharma? How can I transform this mind to virtue and use it to benefit all beings? So let's focus our attention on that and leave our small grievances behind. And really turn our mind to practicing the path, benefiting others, generating the realizations on the path to full awakening. So have you ever noticed how hard it is for us to just accept things? Especially when we get what we think is negative feedback, you know? We automatically have to defend ourselves. And you misunderstood. You don't understand me. You don't appreciate me. You're accusing me of things I didn't do. You. Everything's on the other person. Can we control that other person's mind? No. Are we even sure of what that other person's intention was? No. Does it enter our mind that perhaps we should look at ourselves? No. Why should I do that? It's always the other person's fault. Isn't it? Always their fault. And we've got to make them realize that and prove that to them at all costs. Because if we don't, they will overpower us and we will be humiliated. Which is, you know, the worst tragedy that could happen in the world, isn't it? Definitely the worst tragedy. Yeah. Starving? That never happens to us. Being born in a war zone? No, we're too good for that. Yeah. Incredible, isn't it? How our mind makes big deals out of nothings and feels that they are incredibly important. Yes. And so we keep revolving in samsara. That's the result of it all, isn't it? Yeah. whether we succeed in proving that the other person was wrong or not, the final result is we keep ourselves in samsara. So, if we care about ourselves, we should maybe abandon that technique because it's not working. Okay. Okay, so we've been discussing, the value of the Mahayana teachings and why they are the word of the Buddha. Okay, so on verse 381, let's just review that. Because it's completely the opposite of defending our ego, so it must be wrong. What's Nagarjuna talking about here? Others' aims are achieved through generosity and ethical conduct. Who cares about others' aims? I want my aims. One's own through fortitude and joyous effort. Now we're talking shop. Meditative stability and wisdom lead to liberation. I want liberation from all the people who bug me. Yeah? So just this very innocuous verse seems to be challenging us right up, down, and center, doesn't it? Yeah? I mean, it's pretty innocuous. Others' aims are achieved through generosity and ethical conduct, one's own through fortitude and joyous effort. Meditative stability and wisdom lead to liberation. This summarizes the universal vehicle teachings. But I don't care about the universal vehicle, I want my way. Okay, so when it says others' aims are achieved through generosity and ethical conduct, it's referring to others' immediate aims, in that they're the recipients of our generosity, and through ethical conduct they don't get hurt, so they benefit from that. Of course, generosity and ethical conduct benefit us too. Yeah, generosity is the cause of wealth and having resources, which we will need so that we can be spoiled brats. Have enough resources to practice the Dharma without worry. And ethical conduct is important because it's the cause for an upper rebirth. Okay, one's own aims are fulfilled through fortitude and joyous effort. This again is referring to our immediate, how we immediately benefit from fortitude and joyous effort. So fortitude prevents us from destroying our virtue through getting angry. It also, I'll talk about that in a minute, and joyous effort spurs us to create virtue that we haven't created before. So those both benefit us. Of course, fortitude and joyous effort benefit others. When we practice fortitude, others benefit because we don't punch them in the nose. And when we practice joyous effort, they also benefit because then we like to do, helpful things, and we're pleasant people because we're trying to create virtue. And then meditative stability and wisdom are what's going on here? Meditative stability and wisdom are the that lead to liberation. So wisdom is the actual thing that leads to liberation, because wisdom realizes the opposite of the ignorance that is the root of cyclic existence. But just having that correct understanding of the view of emptiness isn't sufficient, because if we can't keep our mind on it, then we can't really drench our mind in that realization. So meditative stability is really necessary. Otherwise, our minds are flitting all the way, all over the place, kind of like, monkeys or grasshoppers or kitties who get outside without a leash. Let's go, run around. So our minds are like that, so we need the meditative stability to keep them stable, fixed on emptiness. So all the Bodhisattva practices are summarized in these 6, which also summarize all the universal vehicle or Mahayana teachings. And so of these 6, is there anything wrong with any of them? Yeah. I mean, is there anything, when you're thinking in terms of what's virtue and what's not virtue, can you find any fault with these 6 whereby they should be abandoned? No way. Yeah. So if they're virtuous things, then we should practice them. Yeah. So why reject the Mahayana? It doesn't make any sense for those people who do. Okay, so, and then we closed last week in saying that meditation on those 6 is practicing and meditating on the meaning of the Mahayana and reciting the texts, reciting the words are that explain these, is maintaining the words or the scriptures of the Mahayana. Okay. Then 382, in brief, the teachings of the Buddha include what benefits oneself and others, and the way to attain liberation. These topics are contained in the 6 perfections. Therefore, they are also the Buddha's words. Okay, so the fundamental vehicle scriptures teach the causes of higher rebirth and highest good that we covered in chapter 1, and so they help us attain the goal of liberation, which is to fulfill our own aim. And then the Mahayana teachings, the universal vehicle scriptures, additionally teach the 6 paramitas, and so they outline the path to full awakening to Buddhahood. Okay, but the main practices of the 2 vehicles are similar. They're both based on taking refuge, taking precepts, the 4 truths of the Aryas. Yeah, they both talk about love and compassion. So, they both must be the teachings of the Buddha. You can't just, say some are and some aren't. Okay? Because if people who didn't like some of the Mahayana teachings said, well, the Mahayana wasn't taught by the Buddha, then they're also saying where the Buddha taught the 37 harmonies with awakening and refuge and, for the 4 truths that in the Mahayana scriptures, that those must have been mistaken too. But, that doesn't make any sense. Because we really see when we study that the topics discussed in the Mahayana are mentioned in the fundamental vehicle scriptures, but they're mentioned briefly and they're elaborated in the Mahayana. So, there's a lot of ways in which we're taught about the fundamental vehicle nowadays, and a lot of exaggerated statements. So I may say some of them in here, and because it's good that you know what the Tibetans say, and then I'll tell you what I think and what I've learned from research, okay? Okay, so 383, those blinded by ignorance cannot tolerate the universal vehicle in which the Buddha taught the great path, consisting of merit and wisdom that leads to awakening. Okay. Now, first of all, just, when they say, well, I better hold that. This is coming for a later verse. I'm just too eager. Okay, so those blinded by ignorance cannot tolerate the universal vehicle. Okay, so that's because some people reject the teachings on the emptiness of inherent existence and say that to attain liberation, it's the realization of the four truths of the Aryas that's necessary. Now, we would agree you have to realize the four truths of the Aryas, but among the 16 aspects are emptiness and selflessness. Okay? Of course, the way they're spoken of in especially, in the Mahayana scriptures is different than the dominant view presented in the fundamental vehicle scriptures. But as we noted before, that in the Pali canon, there are teachings on the emptiness of inherent existence. So those are there. So it's not really, people tend to equate the Pali canon with the fundamental vehicle, and I don't think that's accurate, because in the Pali canon, you have the presentation of the hero vehicle, solitary realizer vehicle, and the presentation of the bodhisattva vehicle. Now, in the actual canon itself, the bodhisattva vehicle is not well, described. It's minimally described, but it is described much more in some of the later commentarial tradition, or the later scriptures in the Pali that are included in the Pali canon, not necessarily the early ones. But they're definitely there, and like I was telling you before, Dhammapala, who lived in 6th century AD, wrote a treatise on the paramis, the paramitas, and and describing the bodhisattva path according to that, the view of the Pali scriptures, talking about 10 paramis, 10 paramitas. Okay? So these people who don't like the Buddha's teachings on emptiness that are expressed in the universal vehicle scriptures, it's because they say that realizing the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent person is the selflessness of persons. And some of those schools, such as the Vaibhasikas and Sautantrikas, don't assert a selflessness of phenomena at all. Okay, those that do talk about it, the Chittamadrans and Svatantrikas, don't assert the lack of inherent existence as the ultimate truth, as the final meaning of emptiness and selflessness. Okay, whereas the Madhyamaka say that if only realizing the four truths were necessary to attain liberation, why would the Buddha have taught the emptiness of inherent existence in so many sutras? Okay, so that's because, the way they're looking at the four truths in the Pali Canon is that emptiness is negating a permanent, partless, independent self, and selflessness is negating a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. And so they're not negating the full object of negation, so they're not realizing the subtle selflessness or the subtle emptiness. Okay? Whereas, if you look at the four truths from a Mahayana viewpoint, you can fit the understanding of emptiness. You just define emptiness and selflessness differently. Yeah? And everybody's entitled to define them the way they want. Yeah? Because we have the different schools of Buddhist philosophy, and they have different views on this because they define these things differently. By the way, the way that the Tibetans have the 4 systems like that, it's quite codified now, as if people believe in these things, having a catechism that is spelled out in the tenets books that we read. That's not the way it actually was in ancient India. Yeah, there were all sorts of people with different views, and they all debated together and talked to each other, and you might have, over time, the development of, you had the 18 schools, but we all know that whenever you have 2 human beings together, you have 4 opinions. Yeah, so it's not like everybody believed the same thing and had some kind of fixed catechism, not at all. Okay, and actually the Tibetans tend to put the 18 schools all as subdivisions of the Vaibhasikas from the viewpoint of not only the Theravada, but also academic scholars. The Vaibhasikas were actually some very small break-off group. Yeah, they weren't this big thing that, all these other traditions were branches of. They were actually a break-off from the Sarvastivada school, which was one of the 18 schools. Yeah. So it's very interesting, even how you describe history. Yeah, the Tibetans' version of the history of Buddhism, and everybody has their own history and their own way of proving it, and quite interesting, actually. Yeah. Okay, so 384. Since a victor comes from merit, victor meaning the Buddha, comes from merit that is as inconceivable as space, a victor is said to have inconceivable good qualities. Hence, one should accept the greatness of Buddhas as explained in the universal vehicle. Okay. Even just the ethical conduct of the Buddha was beyond Shariputra's ken. Why then wouldn't one accept that the greatness of the Buddhas is inconceivable? Okay, so the argument here is that as limitless beings, we're incapable of really understanding the inconceivable, inexhaustible, limitless qualities of the Buddha. Okay, but if we think that they were created by inconceivable, limitless merit, if the cause was that enormous, then the result should likewise be inexhaustible and inconceivable. Okay, so it's that's the argument to prove these wonderful qualities of the Buddha that are very subtle, very difficult for us to understand, completely beyond our very gross way of understanding things. Okay, and so here it gets into talking about the form body and the truth body of the Buddha. So the form bodies of the Buddhas are the bodies that the Buddha appears in to relate to sentient beings. So these may be enjoyment bodies or Sambhogakaya, how the Buddha appears in Pure Lands to Arya Bodhisattvas, or they may be emanation bodies, how the Buddha appears to ordinary living beings like us. And then the truth body, which is again divided into 2. Part is the wisdom truth body, that is all the wisdom and other enlightened consciousnesses of a Buddha, and then the nature truth body, which is the emptiness of inherent existence of the Buddha's mind, and also the true cessations or of the Buddha's mind. Okay, so these are not spoken of in the fundamental vehicle. Yeah, the way they talk about the Buddha, is quite different in that respect. The Buddha is seen as a human being who went probably from the path of preparation to the path of no more learning in that very life. taught for 45 years, attained nirvana, and that was it. And then any other Buddhas would be the other wheel-turning Buddhas who actually teach the Dharma in an age where it's dark. Okay? So this is the way the Tibetans see the fundamental vehicle. When I was in Thailand, I asked around about this, and the predominant thing was that the Buddha didn't really talk much about what happens when you attain nirvana. Yeah, he talked about how to get there, and then he didn't go into a big description of it. So some people believe that, that when the Buddha or an Arhat passes away, then their body, which was produced by polluted karma, that ceases, and so the person also ceases. Some people believe like that, but other people don't. Yeah, there's a whole school in the forest tradition, actually, Ajahn Mahabua, who talks about the citta, the mind, having a very luminous nature and continuing on, And there's Ajahn Mun, who had visions of the Buddhas and Arhats, yeah. So, there's many different views within Thailand, and I suppose within Sri Lanka and Burma and Laos and Cambodia as well. Okay. So this verse is basically saying we should accept the Buddha's qualities as being so inconceivable because they were created by these absolutely marvelous virtues and causes. And when we study the Bodhisattva practices, then we really see how extraordinary the causes for Buddhahood are, and how difficult they are to practice, and how marvelous they are. Yeah. So here it's also saying that at one time the Buddha, who was it? The Buddha, wait a minute, who was it? Okay. Yeah, so the Buddha asked Shariputra, who was the Arhat foremost in wisdom, if he could explain one quality of the Buddha, let's say the Buddha's ethical conduct. And Shariputra was stumped. He couldn't explain it in full because it was so inconceivable. So that's showing that even from that viewpoint, the causes of being a Buddha are more than we can imagine. Okay, now verse 386 and 387. You'll see the point that they're making in different situations and different commentaries. So we'll go through it here, and then when you meet it elsewhere, you'll have some idea, maybe, of what it's talking about. So it says, the non-arising taught in the universal vehicle and the extinction taught for other Buddhists are both emptiness. Therefore, one should accept that extinction and non-arising are ultimately the same. Emptiness is the majesty of the awakened one. Reflecting thus with reasoning, how could the wise not maintain that what is said in the universal vehicle and the other vehicles are equal? Okay, so here what it's talking about is the knowledge of extinction and the knowledge of non-arising are the same. So the knowledge of extinction is taught in the fundamental vehicle, the knowledge of non-arising is taught in the Mahayana vehicle. Okay, but Nagarjuna is saying that they come to the same point. Okay, so how this is that the term, this is Nagarjuna's interpretation, is that the term extinction refers to the primordial extinction of dukkha and its aggregates. In other words, their emptiness of inherent existence. Okay? So that, he's saying that's what extinction refers to. Often in the Pali scriptures, extinction can refer to nirvana. Yeah? Here he's saying it's referring to emptiness, the primordial emptiness. You know, the fact that dukkha and its causes primordially, without beginning, are empty of inherent existence. Nobody created that emptiness. That's just their nature. Okay? So that's one factor. Then in the universal vehicle, they talk about the non-arising of phenomena. And here, non-arising means not inherently arising. Okay? Sometimes they say non-production, but Jimbo was telling me that the word is really arising. It's not production, because the emphasis is on the action of the result. That the emphasis is not on the cause producing the result, but on the result arising, and it arising, without inherent existence. That the whole process of cause and effect is empty of inherent existence. Okay? So the non-arising refers to phenomena not arising from their own side, okay, under their own power. So they don't inherently arise. So afflictions, dukkha, polluted karma, these things are not inherently produced. They don't arise under their own power, okay? And so that is talking about the emptiness of dukkha and its causes is the same as the meaning of extinction spoken about in the fundamental vehicle, which again is referring to dukkha, the aggregates, the aggregates, of course, including the afflictions, that all these things are empty of inherent existence. Okay? So the knowledge, the mind of knowing the extinction, spoken of in the fundamental vehicle, knows that the self-grasping, the afflictions, the polluted karma, and so forth are naturally empty of inherent existence. And the knowledge of non-arising, that wisdom that knows that's spoken of in the universal vehicle, means that none of those same things arise inherently, so they don't exist inherently, and they are naturally empty of inherent existence. Okay? So what he's basically saying is that the extinction and the non-arising are both speaking about emptiness, so the knowledge of one and the knowledge of other are speaking about the same thing. Okay? So one reason that some hearers don't like the universal vehicle scriptures is because they think that the principal cause for attaining liberation that's explained in the fundamental vehicle is not explained in the universal vehicle. Yeah? Because universal vehicle emphasizes the emptiness of inherent existence. Okay? However, as we just saw here, the fundamental vehicle's scriptures explanation of the knowledge of extinction and the universal vehicle's explanation of the knowledge of non-arising are, both those knowledges are realizing the emptiness of inherent existence. Okay? So for that reason, the hearers should accept the subtle emptiness that's taught in the universal vehicle, because as the word of the Buddha, and also, because it's taught in their own scriptures in a more subtle or hidden fashion. Okay? So it's completely appropriate for fundamental vehicle practitioners to accept the universal vehicle teachings. Okay? And there's two reasons given for that. First is that the principal cause for attaining liberation is indicated in the universal vehicle scriptures, because it talks about non-inherently arising and the emptiness of inherent existence. And that is the same meaning as the fundamental vehicle's knowledge of extinction. Okay? And so that's one of the reasons. And then the second reason is as shown in verse 365, which we'll look at in a minute. The emptiness explained in the universal vehicle is also explained in the fundamental vehicle scriptures. Okay? So that verse, if you check back on it, when we explained it, that's where we talked about especially that one verse that form is like bubbles of foam and feelings are like bubbles of water, and that whole thing, which can be explained to mean the emptiness of inherent existence. Okay? So the main point here is, that in the fundamental vehicle meaning of extinction, Mahayana vehicle, meaning of non-arising, both refer to emptiness, and this emptiness was taught in the fundamental vehicle scriptures. So if this is the case, then there's no reason for the hearers and solitary realizers to reject it. Because the meaning of it is already present in their own scriptures. And then the Mahayana people will go on to say, plus, in order to attain liberation, the arhats need to realize this. So you guys have arhats, so they must realize this. Either that, or maybe, all the people you think who are arhats aren't arhats, which, that wouldn't be very pleasing at all. So they must realize this kind of emptiness. Yeah?
I'm just curious, it's verse 366 that is referring to that ball of foam sutra, and 365 is about how the craving that leads to rebirth ceases. So I wonder if, I'm just curious if that might be
Let me see, because okay, let's do 365 here. Well, 365 is talking about attaining nirvana requires the realization of emptiness, and that's where I explained the ball of foam sutra under 365. Well, not in this commentary. Okay. Okay, where were we? 389. We're almost done with the fourth chapter. Yeah. Okay, so emptiness is the majesty. So the 386, talks about how they're the same. And then 387, emptiness is the majesty of the awakened one. It's the final thing that they realize and the thing that they think is most important to teach, too. So emptiness is the majesty of the awakened one, reflecting thus with reasoning, how could the wise not maintain that what is said in the universal vehicle and the others are equal? Okay? So, if you don't accept the emptiness of inherent existence, you can't accept the cause of the truth body. Now, of course, many people following the Pali scriptures don't accept the truth body. Okay? So maybe this doesn't bother them, but it would certainly bother us. Okay? Because the truth body is how we think of the Buddha. The truth body is an essential part of that. Okay, so emptiness is the focal object of the Arya's meditative equipoise, and in this way it's said to be the, quote, cause of the truth body. Now, emptiness, of course, is permanent, so it can't cause anything, but because it's the focal object that the Arya's meditative equipoise on emptiness is realizing, is called the cause. Okay? So those who are able to analyze with reasoning will find in the universal vehicle scriptures the explanation of the emptiness of inherent existence, of no inherent arising, and in the fundamental vehicle scriptures the explanation of extinction are equal in indicating emptiness. Okay? And so that's why that last line in the verse is setting, and what is said in the universal vehicle and the other are equal. So, they're both equal in referring to emptiness. So given that, then the universal vehicle scripture should be the Buddha's word, because they're teaching the final meaning of emptiness, which is also present in the universal vehicle scriptures, because the meaning of the knowledge of extinction and the meaning of non-arising are the same. Okay? Okay, so then 388. What the Tathagata has stated with a hidden intention is not easy to understand. For this reason, there is said to be one vehicle and also three. Therefore, protect yourself by being equanimous. And 389, by being equanimous, you do nothing wrong, but negativity comes from anger. How could virtue? Hence, those who seek what is good for themselves should not despise the universal vehicle. So here Nagarjuna is saying, it's difficult to understand the Tathagata's actual intention, which we'll talk about in a minute. And if you don't understand it, and instead you despise the Mahayana or get angry at it or criticize it, you're only harming yourself, because anger creates only non-virtue, never virtue. Yeah. So if you're looking out even for your own welfare, don't criticize it just because it doesn't make sense to you right now, but remain equanimous. Okay? So the Buddha was a very skillful teacher, and he taught according to the dispositions and the tendencies of the various people who came. And since people have all sorts of dispositions and tendencies, he had to teach different things in order to skillfully lead people on the path. Yeah. And so he said different things at different times to different people. Yeah. So some people look at that and say, well, either the Buddha was confused and he didn't know what he was talking about, because he said this here and he said that there, and the explanations don't match. So either the Buddha was confused, or he was lying. So, because otherwise these things don't match. So it's very important here to understand that when the Buddha said different things to different people, he wasn't lying, because he knew very clearly in his own mind what his real intention was of saying different things. So he may have said something to somebody that sounded in a literal way like one thing, and that thing was appropriate for that person to understand at that time. It would help them. But actually, if you were to delve deeper into it and use reasoning, you would see that actually the meaning of what the Buddha said was something else. So he wasn't lying, because he was very clear in his own mind, and he was doing this for a particular reason in order to benefit different sentient beings. Okay, so this comes a lot when you talk about the Chittamatra sutras and you know what they say. But even before what they talk about that, there's one sutra where the Buddha was talking to King Ajatasattu. I think that's how you pronounce his name, Ajatasattu. Anyway, I think he was King Bimbisara's son, and he wanted the throne, and so he killed his father and his mother. And then after he did that, he felt, you know, he was glad to get the throne, but at some point he felt a lot of regret. And so the Buddha said to him, you know, kill your father, kill your mother. Now, clearly, if you take that literally, you would say the Buddha was like, you know, what in the world is he saying? Kill your father and kill your mother. Those are both, you know, those are two of the heinous crimes that are so negative. But what it did is he said that to Ajatasattu at that time to ease his guilt. And then by easing his guilt, it opened his mind a bit to be able to understand the teachings and to do purification and so on. So it was a skillful thing that the Buddha said to him. It should not be taken literally. Okay? The Buddha's real intention was saying that, I forget if it was craving and clinging or craving and renewed existence, either the 8th and 9th links or the 8th and 10th links of the 12 links. Those are what should be killed. Okay? So that's what father and mother meant, was those 2 links, because if you destroy them, then there's no rebirth in samsara. Okay? So also in the in some sutras, you know, the Buddha said everything is mind only. Yeah. So then the Chittamatra says, oh, that means there's no external objects. Yeah. But the Buddha's final intention, according to the Prasangikas, was that everything exists by independence upon being designated by term and concept. Okay, so when he said everything is mind only, he didn't mean, you know, no external objects, and he didn't mean some kind of thing like the objects or the mind or something like that, but that everything exists independence upon term and concept. In other words, by the mind designating things. So there are a lot of the Chittamatra statements like this, where the explanation according to the Mahayana is different, and it shows, you know, that the Buddha said different things to different people at different times because it was skillful. So another example of this is when the Buddha taught that there were 3 final vehicles. So in some sutras, he said there's 3 final vehicles. In other sutras, for example, the Lotus Sutra, he said there's 1 final vehicle. So what this means, you know, 3 or 1, is, you know, we have the 3 vehicles here, solitary realizer and bodhisattva. Saying that there's 3 final vehicles means that if you practice the path to arhatship according to the hero vehicle, you become an arhat, and that's it. You've reached the culmination of the path, that's it, okay? Same with solitary realizer, you reach the culmination of that path, which is also arhatship. That's it. You never go on to practice the bodhisattva path. You never go on to create the causes for full awakening. It's final vehicle in that you attain that spiritual aim, and that's it. Okay? When they say 1 final vehicle, what it means is that, yes, arhats, here and solitary realizer arhats have attained the end of their own vehicles, but they haven't attained full awakening yet. So the Buddha will wake them up from their deep meditation, meditative equipoise on emptiness and say, you still have some more work to do. There's still other sentient beings to take care of. And so at that point, they have to go back to the beginning of the Bodhisattva path and accumulate all the merit that the Bodhisattvas have accumulated. So they've already realized emptiness and removed the afflictive obscurations. So in terms of that realization, they're comparable to a bodhisattva on the 8th ground. But because they haven't accumulated all the merit, they have to start over on the bodhisattva path of accumulation and then work their way up. Okay. So, one of the reasons they say 3 final vehicles is the idea lying behind that is that, the Arhat attains that liberation. While they're alive, they have nirvana with remainder, the remainder being the body that was produced by polluted karma. And when they pass away and they leave that body, then they attain the nirvana without remainder. And so that is considered the termination or extinction of the aggregates. Yeah. And that's how many people interpret extinction in the fundamental vehicle. Okay? So in that way, if you accept that and you're willing to put all the fundamental vehicle people into having one philosophical position, which, like I say, I don't think you can. But if for the sake of argument you were, okay, then those arhats, while they were alive, they've attained liberation. When they pass away, their aggregates cease, so the person no longer exists, but their nirvana without remainder does. So when there's the nirvana without remainder, there's no person. But when there's the person, there's no final nirvana. Yeah, because the person would be before the arhat passes away. Okay, so that sounds a little bit strange to say that you have nirvana, but there's nobody who attained it. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so a bodhisattva's nirvana is called a non-abiding nirvana. Yeah, meaning that it doesn't abide in 2 extremes. And here, the 2 extremes are not the usual one. Here, it's the extreme of samsara. Okay, so being under the influence of afflictions and polluted karma. That's one extreme. And the other extreme is your own personal peace, your own personal arhatship is called an extreme because you can stay in that for a whole long time. Yeah, and that's an extreme when you consider that there's all these sentient beings who've been kind to us who need our help in getting out of samsara. Okay, so a Buddha's nirvana doesn't abide in either samsara or that self-complacent peace. So it's called non-abiding nirvana. Okay, sometimes, they talk about 4 kinds of nirvana. This is helpful to go through. Natural nirvana, nirvana with remainder, nirvana without remainder, and non-abiding nirvana. Okay, natural nirvana means the natural emptiness of persons and phenomena, the fact that everything by their own nature are empty. Yeah, so that's actually the nirvana, the emptiness that we realize, that when we realize helps to liberate us. Then nirvana with and without remainder has 2 meanings. The common meaning to all the philosophical tenet systems is that nirvana with remainder is when an arhat is still alive and has their body and their mind, the aggregates, and nirvana without remainder is when they pass away and they give up the aggregate, especially the polluted body. From another viewpoint, the Prasangikas talk about nirvana with and without remainder, meaning a nirvana nirvana without remainder is actually attained first, and that's referring to the Arya's meditative equipoise on emptiness, which has no remainder of inherent existence. And then the nirvana with remainder is when they arise from that meditative equipoise and still have the appearance of true existence. Okay? So in the common version of with and without remainder, it's referring primarily to the body, the aggregates, and to the special prasangika view, the remainder is the appearance of true existence. Okay, and then non-abiding nirvana, I just explained. Okay. So it's helpful to be aware of that. Yeah, because there's all sorts of terms, and what they mean in one situation is not what they mean in another situation. Okay. Okay, so this whole thing about 3 vehicles and 1 vehicle, and the Buddha's skill in teaching different things to different people, this brings up the whole topic of what's called interpretable or provisional teachings and definitive teachings. Yeah, so the interpretable or provisional ones are ones either where what the Buddha said cannot be taken literally, or they're talking about conventional objects, and which are not the final mode of existence. Whereas the definitive teachings, this is according to the Prasangika, the definitive teachings are those about emptiness. Okay. But again, each school has their own definition of definitive and interpretable. Yeah, according to what they assert to be the final object that you realize, which depends on the final object of negation. So there's so much of the difference between the different schools that hinges on what the object of negation is when you're meditating on emptiness. Okay, and so His Holiness says to really discern the difference between definitive and provisional, you need to use reasoning, because you need to see that the actual mode of existence is the emptiness of inherent existence. Okay, and so if you don't understand the difference between the interpretable and definitive teachings, instead of rejecting things that seem foreign to you, then Nagarjuna is just saying, remain equanimous, don't get angry, chill out, folks, and put it on the back burner for the time being and practice what you find useful and helpful to you. Yeah? Which I think is always good advice, isn't it? We should never try and force ourselves to believe something like, I've got to believe this. Yeah. I mean, we contemplate it. If it makes sense, good. If it doesn't, we just leave it for a while, still continuing to investigate it, use reasoning, talk to people, discuss it. Okay? So I think that's quite wise advice. But in the process of saying, I don't really understand this, and until I understand it, I can't accept it, then to at least don't reject it. Yeah, to say, well, yeah, these could be the Buddha's teachings, so I don't want to criticize, I don't want to reject, I'm going to continue to keep an open mind. Okay, so to look at it in that way. Okay. And then verse 390, the Bodhisattva's aspirational prayers are not taught in the hearer vehicle, nor are their practices, nor the dedications. How could one become a bodhisattva through that vehicle? And 391, in the other vehicles, the Buddhas did not state the foundation for the bodhisattva's awakening. what source is better than the victors for attaining reliable knowledge on this topic? Okay, so here it's saying not all bodhisattva practices are explained completely in fundamental vehicle scriptures. So that's true, they're not explained completely, but you can't say they're not explained at all. Okay? Yeah, so it's just meaning that in the fundamental vehicle sutras, the Buddha went through these things in a brief way. Then when he came to teach the Mahayana scriptures, he went through them in a very elaborate way. And so some of the topics, here it mentions the Bodhisattva's aspirational prayers, the Bodhisattva's practices, the Bodhisattva's dedication, that those were things that were elaborated on in the Mahayana. But what was I just going to say? There was something else. Well, clearly the view of emptiness, was elaborated on in the Mahayana with many more reasonings. But some of those reasonings, you find them in the fundamental vehicle scriptures too. Like this big reason, the reasoning of not produced by self, other, both, and causelessly. That's Nagarjuna's first verse in fundamental wisdom. There's Pali Sutras where the Buddha talks about suffering does not arise from itself, from other, from both, or causelessly. And there's suffering as the example. And there's another one, I forget what the example was, but it's the same argument. Yeah? It's quite interesting, it's not like these, so you can tell that Nagarjuna was quite familiar with the fundamental vehicle scriptures, but the way he interpreted them and explained them was very different than what was being done at his time. But he was clearly familiar with them, because that very first verse is right there in the Pali Suttas. Yeah. It's quite interesting. When we get in November, when we do Buddhism, One Teacher, Many Traditions, there's a chapter that talks about selflessness and some of the parallels there. It's really very interesting. Okay, so in the same way, the aspirational prayers that the bodhisattvas make, especially those that they make once they've attained the first bodhisattva ground. Okay, they are very strong aspirations, very strong resolute determinations, and these are found, in an abbreviated form in the fundamental vehicle, but in a very expanded form in the Mahayana. Although it's very interesting. One of the paramis, if I'm remembering correctly, I'm not sure if I'm remembering correctly, but I was going to say I think one of the paramis may be resolute determination, but I can't remember, so let's not take me for granted at that point. Okay? But it's quite interesting. I think I mentioned this before, that many of the paramis in the fundamental vehicle are the same as in the Mahayana. Some of them have the same names and very similar explanations. Some of them have different names, but the whole point is explained in the other vehicle. Like one of the paramis in the fundamental vehicle is truthfulness. Now, truthfulness, of course, in the Mahayana vehicle is extremely important. It's not mentioned as one of the paramitas, but certainly the meaning is there in the teachings. Okay? So there's many things like that where if it's not the exact term for the 10 paramitas, because Mahayana also actually has 10 paramitas, then the meaning is there in the other vehicle in one way or another. Okay, then the Bodhisattva's dedication, Also in the, is not found in an expanded version in the Pali Suttas, yeah, whereas in the Mahayana Suttas, the dedication is very, very vast. And an example of that is the King of Prayers from the Avatamsaka, or Flower Ornament Sutra. Okay, so, King of Prayers is pretty vast and inconceivable, isn't it, when you really read it? It's quite amazing, yeah. And so that's really showing us how to dedicate in this, huge, enormous, far-reaching way, yeah. And even saying the words when you read it, if your mind's stuck in a very narrow, you read the King of Prayers and your mind goes, woo, because you're visualizing Buddhas in a single atom surrounded by bodhisattvas, and all the atoms are like this, and yeah, your mind just expands, enormously. Okay, and so similarly, the 20 verses that Nagarjuna wrote that we'll come to, they also have that same kind of expansiveness in them, about how to dedicate your merit. Because Nagarjuna says, may I be like the, like the earth, water, fire and air, the four elements, and may I be like the trees and the flowers that belong to everybody, and may people use me, accordingly. Yeah, so that's pretty vast, isn't it? You say, you can't use me accordingly, I'll have you arrested. That's abuse. What? Yes. Yeah. Okay. So the fundamental vehicle doesn't teach how to engage in the vast practices of the two collections that lead to the two Buddha bodies. Yeah. But there's parts of it that are in there, like when we went through all the 32 signs of the Buddha and their causes. All of those causes were things that are regarded as virtue in the Fundamental Vehicle Sutras. Yeah, they're all regarded as virtue. Yeah, so there's a hint taught there, but then it's expanded in the Mahayana. Okay, so the view of emptiness, the aspirational prayers, the dedication, the way we talk about generosity also, for example, in the Mahayana Sutras, is very different. In the Pali Sutras, they don't really talk about giving your body, for example. In the Mahayana Sutras, yes, you give your body. And, they say that for the bodhisattvas, giving their body is like us giving a carrot. Yeah? Somebody wants a carrot, you give them a carrot. Unless you're like me, and then you say, what do you want a carrot for? What are you going to use that carrot for? I don't know if I'm going to give you a carrot. This is my carrot, and I'm going to be without it if I give it to you. So you better have a good reason and explain it to me. Okay, but bodhisattvas give their body, I think they have some discriminating wisdom. They don't just give their body to, any old way. They have to figure out how to do it in the proper way, in the best circumstances. Okay, shall we pause here and see if there's some questions or comments? Yeah.
Can you say again, when you were talking about why you don't equate organic?
Oh, why not? Yeah, because in that fundamental vehicle, you're just talking about the paths that lead to arhatship hearers and solitary realizers arhatship. Whereas in the Pali canon, there's talk of the bodhisattva path. And in the vehicle, the Pali, what's sprouted from either the canon or the later commentaries, there is a bodhisattva path described, which most people do not know. Yeah, and they think it's not mentioned at all, but it is. I mean, first of all, they talked about the Buddha being a Buddha, so and being a bodhisattva, so they must, certainly believe in the bodhisattva vehicle. Yeah. Okay.
I'm just curious,
Mhm.
I mean, as time goes on, we start seeing that there's a whole lot more similarities between the fundamental and the universal vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
Is it that people that practice both of those vehicles didn't take the time to understand each other's vehicle? Or was there just a misinterpretation as time went on, as what was definitive and what was provisional? And where did we go awry?
Yeah, so where did we get this, Yeah. It's hard to say, because it seems like at the very beginning you had people practicing with the bodhisattva motivation and with the hearer motivation in the same monastery. So at the beginning it just started out to be a difference in motivation, and then it kind of grew into maybe a difference in emphasis and practice, and then different sutras, and I think probably my guess is, this is my guess, that when you got to the thing of different sutras, that's when people started reacting. Because just having a slightly different motivation or doing your practice in a slightly different way, but you're all living in the same monastery, keeping the same Vinaya, doing your Vinaya activities together, I don't think that would create a lot of, disharmony. But if you have the Mahayana Sutras appearing where they hadn't been known before, and some people saying, oh, those are fake, yeah, my guess is that's when you might start getting the hostility or the disagreement. Yeah. But the difference in the sutras, I mean, you had the Prajnaparamita sutras appearing quite early on, 1st century BC, and then some of the other ones appearing, other Mahayanas after that. And those early Mahayana sutras, they didn't use, as I remember, if I remember correctly, they didn't emphasize this whole Hinayana thing. That only came later. And so when the later Mahayana vehicles started saying, Hinayana is inferior and we're the best, then when you have that written in scriptures, then of course the people who don't follow those scriptures are going to say, you're looking down on us, you're criticizing us. Your scriptures aren't the word of the Buddha, because why would the Buddha criticize, his own teachings? Why would the Buddha make Shariputra look like a fool? Yeah, so that's my guess, that's when it started. Yeah?
I was always curious, why are there no ordinary bodhisattvas when Buddha was teaching? Why are they all?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I've thought about that too, because you would think that the Buddha, was a bodhisattva, became a Buddha. You would think that some of his disciples would want to follow the same path that he did, and that there would be bodhisattvas practicing at that time openly, as well as people practicing here in solitary realizer vehicles. So you would think that, but I don't know if if they'd probably say, the Tibetans would probably say that the disposition of the majority of the people at that time was not the Mahayana disposition, and so that's why the scriptures were kept hidden and private, until there became people who were the right recipients for it, who could actually bear it or understand it. That's what they'd probably say. But still, it makes you wonder, why didn't...
The scriptures, somebody must be passing it down.
Right. So the other alternative is that you had people practicing the Bodhisattva vehicle, but they did it really hush-hush. Yeah. So they just minded their own business. Because, this was the real thing about the Bodhisattva vehicle, wasn't it? And always has been, that you don't show off, you don't make a big deal about yourself. You always appear very ordinary. So it could be that there were bodhisattvas just practicing very quietly at that time. Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious then about the role of the great Buddhist universities in relationship to this topic.
Mm-hmm.
Because of course we always think that they were all Mahayana schools, but maybe they weren't.
Well, they had people from all different philosophical viewpoints. They even had non-Buddhists at the Buddhist universities. They even had nuns. That's really outrageous. Yeah. I'm sure they'd much rather have samkhya's before they have nuns. But they had samkhya's, and they did have some nuns. Must have been very brave nuns, I think. Huh?
If the Buddha was a bodhisattva himself, it's impossible that he was the only bodhisattva in the universe.
Yeah, well, see, that's why in the fundamental vehicle they say that there's only the only Buddhas are the wheel-turning Buddhas, and so then only they need to be bodhisattvas. Everybody else can just go for their own liberation as arhats. So that's how they would explain it. But from our viewpoint, if everybody has the Buddha nature, then there should be bodhisattvas and other Buddhas and people practicing this. But they don't use the term Buddha nature in the Pali Suttas, as far as I understand it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What is a simple way to explain to people who challenge like the Mahayana is not a teaching of Buddha without going through all of the
Yeah. Okay. So 25-word version or less. I think that the point that we started out with at the beginning, you look at the 6 paramitas. What's wrong with the 6 paramitas? Yeah? Same meaning found in the fundamental vehicle. All of them are virtuous activities. Yeah? This is the heart of the Mahayana Sutras. So how can you fault the Mahayana Sutras? And if the Buddha didn't teach these marvelous practices, how could you say that, some ordinary sentient being did? Yeah, when they're the same marvelous practices that you find in the fundamental vehicle. Mm-hmm.
It's compelling to me that we have bodhisattvas in that canon.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it seems like, I don't know.
Yeah. This all in terms of becoming a wheel-turning Buddha.
Yeah.
But they have them. Yeah. And they have the whole story of the Buddha and how he generated bodhicitta. It's very touching. Very, very moving. Huh?
Where's that?
That's in the Vamsa, Buddha. I think Buddha Vamsa, you call it, or Buddha, yeah, one of those. It's a text called The Life Stories of the Buddhas. That maybe I'll give you the English, that's easier. Yeah. And there they talk about the life stories of many previous Buddhas. Yeah. And they all have certain things that they did at certain times, and they all received a prophecy, and they all generated bodhicitta, and yeah, it's quite interesting. There's a whole.
Is it part of the Mahayana scripture?
No, this is yeah, yeah. I think it may be one of the later things, but it's not a commentary. I think it's in the canon itself. Yeah, we have it in our library. No, it's in our library in a hardback, slender volume with a brown cover. Yeah. Uh-huh.
It would seem to me that the fact that Buddha taught different things to different people is actually a huge teaching on emptiness, because the teachings that he gave were depending on rising, depending on the minds that were there to receive
Yeah.
such teachings.
Yeah, yeah. You know, and dependent arising in that kind of context indicates his skill. It's not indicating emptiness so much, but indicating the Buddha's skill. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Going back to the previous point, someone is asking whether the Jataka tales are from the Pali or Mahayana canon, and whether they can be viewed as the Bodhisattva path teachings because they describe the Buddha's journey.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's also, I forgot about that. The Jataka tales are in both the Pali canon and the Mahayana canon. And yes, they do talk about the Buddha's life as a bodhisattva. So they would be describing some of the bodhisattva activities there. Yeah, for sure. But what's interesting is the Jataka tales were also known to non-Buddhists. Yeah, they were popular tales in ancient India of, you know. Mm-hmm.
Today, when Bodhisattva was asking about this Tibetan Dhammapada,
Mm-hmm.
and I was assuming that it was translated from Sanskrit. But in the
Yeah.
introduction, they said they don't know. He actually
Ah.
said flat out, it could have come from, doesn't make sense to me exactly, Pali, Sanskrit, or
Prakrit. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of the things they don't really know. Well, they don't know what language the Buddha actually taught, but it's in the Kangyur. Yeah.
The way they didn't exactly use that word, but they said that the one that has 108 scriptures.
Yeah, that's the Kangyur. Yeah. But, you know, many of the suttas in the Mahayana were also translated from like Gandhari and other languages. Not all of them were from Sanskrit. Yeah. That are in the Tibetan canon now. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the majority were, but not all of them, because many of them were found in that whole region of Gandhara in Afghanistan and northern Pakistan and up into Central Asia. That used to be a real a place of Buddhism flourishing.